Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Goaltending, where your why is bigger than your excuses. Today, we're talking about mental toughness, growth from adversity, and finding your why with an incredible guest with a lot of experience in the background of all three categories. Before I introduce him, as always, thank you for allowing us to be a part of your journey. It truly means the world. And this episode is going to drop on October 1st. So Suicide Prevention Awareness Month just ended, but is really an important topic to discuss and keep in mind all year round. And so it was a big part of wanting to focus on resiliency with this episode. And I want to encourage you, check on your friends. And if you are going through anything, don't be afraid to ask for help. Too many people suffer in silence. And so I also want to remind you, this episode is fueled by Prepping with Peppers. And with no further ado, let's get into our guest. I hope that in your life, you have met somebody where you just instantly say, this is an outstanding, incredible person, right? When I met this guy, we were at the Resilience, Risk Reduction, and Suicide Prevention Conference, and we just instantly clicked, like incredible conversations to the point that we did not want the conversation to end. You know, we hung out through the evening and hit so many different topics, just did not want the conversation to end. And I was so blown away by some of the things we got into. I said, I need you to come on the podcast and let's just kind of rehash some of those topics we talked about, because they're so insightful and can help people so much in their journey. And so the guy I brought in today, 19 years in uniform in the United States Army, right? Is all of it Army?
Yeah, it's all Army Guard, yeah.
Yeah, so infantryman, also just commissioned as an intelligence officer. So huge congratulations on that and commissioning, becoming an officer. Some people call it joining the dark side, but you will sincerely be a valuable asset with your experience. In getting in the resilience piece, he's got like 4 to 5 years of working with the resiliency program for his state. So incredible experience with understanding all of the skills that are involved in building and developing resiliency in your life. And also a family man, married, 1 little girl, incredible person. Joey Levesque, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It was actually, I feel very fortunate to have met you. I'll just be up front. I'm not really a people person. I kind of stick to myself a lot of the time, but we met, we're down in New Orleans, hung out for like 20 minutes. You had a floral shirt on. I was like, man, I got to talk to this dude. And just immediately started talking about all the things. And I feel very fortunate to have met you. And thank you so much for having me on today.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time. And really, let's just get right into a little bit of the resiliency piece. One of the things that we talked about is you having a huge background with 19 years as an infantryman. We got to talking about resilience and resilience training in the military. So I just want to talk about, what was your initial perception of resilience training when it was introduced to you?
So initially when Resilience was put out, I was an E4. So it was prior to like 2010. And in like the infantry world, everybody's all like grunts and I'm just being the toughest that I can. Like there's at least at the time, there's a very alpha mentality with all things. And like you never admit that you can't do something, or this was a lot during that time. You couldn't admit that you couldn't do something. You would force it. Like if there was a wall in your way, you would smash that wall with your skull until either your skull was cracked in or the wall was down. And that's just kind of the way it was. And I'm not saying there weren't smart people there, but that's just kind of how it went.
Oh, yeah.
So when resiliency first came in, a lot of the focus of it was more on the emotional side of it, where and there's nothing wrong with this, where you just expressed your feelings and how you were in the moment and how it made you feel and talked about it in the connection. And it kind of really turned a lot of us in the line off, because there are times when that's not a real concept. You can't do that. right? So Dr. Martin Seligman, who's one of the pioneers of the program, who wrote it for UPenn for the Army, you said that you can't just stop what you're doing sometimes and hunt the good stuff. You can't stop what you're doing and explore how that feels. And in
Mm-hmm.
a combat field or combat environment, it's not a real thing. You know what I mean? If you have a job to do and either you're receiving rounds or it's even just a small detail that's got to get done for the next mission,
Mm-hmm.
you can't be like, hey, stop, time out. Let's talk about this and explore this together and figure out the best way to go about it. You just have to get through it.
Oh yeah.
And so when the program first came out and a lot of the focus was on the emotional side of the house, it turned off a lot of people,
Yeah.
at least in my from my perception.
No, I mean that makes sense. I'm curious. This kind of just popped in my head. Like, I also want to relate this to an audience outside of the military. And as I'm thinking through that, I'm thinking of super high op tempo. So like maybe not every second rounds are flying at you, and people that are trying to relate outside of this have never been in that situation, but maybe in a super high op tempo life, like thing after thing after thing, no time to rest, no time to think. Would you say that minus the rounds, the danger, that might be a similar situation to processing and dealing emotionally with the things going on in life if you're living in that high up tempo place?
So I think a really good example of that, like excluding what we would immediately think of danger. So like you can think of first responders, right?
Hmm.
So like police have that, could be danger. Firefighters have that, definitely surrounded by danger. But
Hmm.
like let's think about paramedics,
Hmm.
right? Traditionally, when they're in their op tempo environment, they don't always experience danger. Not every one of their patients is a dangerous person, right? But they ultimately see people going through very traumatic events,
Hmm.
had been in dangerous situations, are making life and death decisions for people, and that kind of trauma, like for the paramedic, like being in that moment where like this is not good, this is terrible, this person's bleeding, there's a car crash, whatever, what have you, and like you're seeing that with not just people you would expect to see that with, but like children and geriatrics and people who can't defend themselves. In that moment, they really can't take the time to process and talk about the feelings,
Yeah.
right? They have to process the casualty first. So
Yeah.
I think on the civilian side, I would equate it more like that if we're not talking about
Okay.
danger.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean that's a great point in terms of like that initial reception, like receptiveness of the program. Like this doesn't seem realistic in a certain kind of environment to be able to implement these skills. So, what is your why behind getting involved with the resiliency program?
So my why, so it's changed over the years. Initially, I went through it, um, and I did it because it was a thing that the Army wanted me to do. They're like, hey, we need to train some RTAs to learn how to hunt the good stuff and talk to other people. And I did that. I did the check the block, as we like to say. And then I went to the MRT school, got kind of interested in it, and just prior to going down to that school, I read a book called "Can't Hurt Me" by a
Hmm.
gentleman by the name of David Goggins.
Yep.
Probably infamous at this point. Very, very phenomenal story.
Oh yeah.
Um, oh yeah, second one was real good too.
Yep.
But he talked about resilience without saying resilience.
Yeah.
He just talked about mental toughness.
Mm.
And that really changed the way that I look at how we should be applying the resilient skills to, at a minimum, my unit at the time, but combat units, so that we can change the perception. Um, and then later on down the road, like unfortunately, many people in our our specific careers. A friend of mine had lost his life due to self harm. He ended his own life, and I was a seven at the time, and my why currently is trying to push out to as many people, make as many changes with the BH realm for the combat forces as
Hmm.
humanly possible. It's actually why I commissioned.
Yeah. That's impactful, and a lot of there's a lot of things. I think there's significant life events that sometime happen in our lives that that is kind of the barrier, like what helps us get over a barrier in our minds, almost like it pushes us to a different way of thinking, which obviously nobody wants a traumatic event, a loss of a life, like to lose somebody that they care about. But when those things happen, a lot of times they force you to have to think differently or to see something in a different way and kind of open your mind to something that you didn't see before. Real quick, there was a couple of acronyms that were thrown out in there, so I want to make sure
Sorry.
for people listening. No problem. Uh, RTA is just Resilience Training Assistance. MRT is Master Resilience Trainer. And same thing. I had no knowledge of the resiliency program when I first commissioned, and I was told like, "Hey, we need you to go to this RTA course." And I was like, "Okay, I'm sure." Like a week of
Sure.
orders, I guess. Voluntold, same thing.
Yep.
And I was like, I really enjoyed the course, and I was like, I think I'd like to do MRT at some point. I guess I didn't really get quite engaged enough to actively pursue that, but I knew I enjoyed like learning about it. And I'd say that was around 2013. So the program was still pretty young then at that point, I think. Um, but it wasn't until 2019. So we're talking 6 years later before I actually did MRT. And once I did that and was actually able to take it and start teaching my unit, and I saw it impact people's lives, and I saw soldiers come to me and say, like, man, I practiced this skill after you taught it, and it had a huge impact. It helped me in some way. That was when I fell in love with it. And that's when I saw like when you can find a way to get a soldier to relate to it, when you or a person to relate to a skill, you just have to find some way to bridge that gap. So exactly what you said, if as an infantryman, like you're like, nah, I don't care about the resiliency. We don't got time for that. But once you learn the word mental toughness and thought of it differently, it opened your mind, right?
Yes. So like once the perception changed and the language that was used was different,
Mm-hmm.
it made it was massively impactful for me as a human. It's actually really funny. So 2019, 2020 is when I went to MRT,
Mm-hmm.
and like I started getting deep into it then. So it's around the same time frame where my perception of it really changed and how I taught it really changed as well. So it's actually kind of funny that it's the same time period.
Yeah, but I like that because I think sometimes anything in life, let's say you get taught something or you're put in a position to train people on something. I think a lot of times, I know early on, if I was taught something, I felt like I had to teach it exactly the way that I was told, maybe at first, like it has to be this way. And it was not until much later in life that I was like, first off, not everybody receives information the same way,
Yep.
and when you think of people coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, different traumas that they've dealt with, like you can't just have a cookie cutter way all the time. But by having a broad understanding of the concepts, you can find ways to deliver a message in a way that it will reach that person.
Yeah, so that I think that's such an impactful thing, especially with this program, because if you see people teach, when you teach it, you're supposed to teach specifically to the curriculum. So if you get a person who just teaches it to the curriculum but doesn't talk about it as a person, it doesn't always hit the same as somebody who's like, all right, well, I need to tell you these things because that's what it says. But also, just so you know, this is why it's helped me out and this is how I see it. And like, this is how it's impacted my world. And then just massive changes in how it's received because of the broader understanding of the topics and wanting to talk about it as a human being versus excuse me, versus just getting through the material because you're supposed to teach it at that time.
Yeah. No, that's I think that that's one of the biggest challenges sometimes in terms of for the military, we've got our mandatory briefs. Like we need to train these things, but because it's a mandatory brief and because it's like, all right, we need to get these done so that we can also meet our other training requirements, um, people might not take it as seriously because it's not being presented as a human. It's not being presented authentically in a way to connect. It's being presented because we need to complete this training.
So we for the longest time, what we used to do was sit there on a PowerPoint, like drill schedule for the National Guard, like November, like holiday season, right? You have to get all of your PowerPoint stuff done because the rest of the time in the infantry you're in the field,
Mm-hmm.
right? So on the holidays you're at the armory, and then those days are just jam packed with PowerPoints in a classroom, getting all the stuff going in. So the brush line can say, "Hey, we did what we were supposed to do." What I found was on the times that we were out in the field, where it was you and just soldiers, right? Just pulling a group aside, and be like, "Hey, we're going to talk about why hunting the good stuff is important, right? But we're not going to talk about it like a PowerPoint. Be like, hey, we're just going to talk about gratitude. And if we think about it as human beings for a little bit, how much less of mean spirited people we are if we're not just focused on the negative." And I actually think the outside classes are so much more impactful than the
Mm-hmm.
checking the block PowerPoints,
Yeah.
even though they're
No.
necessary. They're definitely necessary.
Yeah, it's necessary, and I think it's the thing that it helps give the broad understanding, but it requires those outside conversations, like the more intimate conversation that is actually like real life. This is how you apply a skill. Like you could hear somebody's story and say, "Hey, man, like I know you were talking about this going on. This is a skill, you know what I mean? Like this is a way that you can apply this and what you have going on in your life." And that creates a value for the person. They're like, "You mean if I do this, like it's actually going to make the situation better?" And in connecting through that human aspect and then creating value for them, they then are like, "Yeah, I'm bought in. Like I will
Yeah.
actually do that or try that." I
Yeah.
like that a lot. So while we're like, I'm loving it already. I mean, uh, let's keep talking growth. But you posed the question the day we met. I mean, we're just hanging out, chatting, and you dropped this question on me, and it has stuck with me. I've posed it to other people because I enjoyed talking about it so much. But you said, do I think people grow more from environment or people? So can you talk about just the meaning of that question and then kind of your thoughts and your response on it?
So I've actually thought about this quite a bit since talking to you about it as well.
Yeah.
um, because it's a very layered question, and there's so much involved in it. So my intent in the question was, so I think at that time we were talking about both of our backgrounds as human beings, like where we grew up from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it wasn't always the nicest of environments. Is really what I'll say. The
Yeah.
most conducive to being what we would consider successful as human beings right now. So my reason in asking the question is because some people make it out of that and some people don't. So what's the catalyst there for change, for positive change and positive growth? Is the catalyst the environment that you have, or is it just the person in the environment?
Oh yeah. No, so that breakdown is way better. And so like for context, I mean, we're talking the challenging things in our lives in this point of our conversation, you know. So I mean, brought up coming from a single parent home, um that struggles in childhood, like not the greatest neighborhood sometimes, and going on to face challenges of the military and like going through basic and going away from home and ultimately like growing through these different challenging environments, like growing through adversity, and the challenges. And I took the question as like not just the when it was environment or people. I wasn't thinking like people as in me. Did it have to do with me or environment? But rather, are the people surrounding me or the people that you're around versus the environment that you're in. And there's like a, if you're doing a Venn diagram, there's a pretty big area in the middle where the two overlap. And so my first response was, political. It's both, but I love that Joey challenged me and he said, no, like, we're not being political right now. Pick something, like, think about it and pick something. And I'm a very, I had to think about it both ways, but I'm a very like people oriented person. And so I've had multiple people in my life impact me, influence me. And while I ultimately still had to take the actions, like I had to be willing to do hard things, I don't know that I would have ended up in the same place if it weren't for some of the influences that helped guide along the way. But at the same time, the environment, the environment's like, had I not gotten away from home, I wouldn't have been around some of the people that impacted and influenced me, and it was getting out of the not great environment and seeing a different way that things could be that opened my mind to the possibility of more.
So I love this conversation. It's so good. So what I was thinking about the last couple of days was the Chicago Bulls 90 era, right? So
Okay.
Michael Jordan, Chicago Bulls. Michael Jordan, and I'm not the biggest sports guy. I'm not, but he is arguably to basically anybody the best basketball player of all time. Right? Fair. I think that's a
Oh yeah.
fair assessment.
Fair assessment.
Right? Who won all of those championships?
Hmm. He had a strong supporting cast, I will say. But when you take Michael Jordan out of this equation, he won 3. When he left, they lost.
Hmm.
He came back, they won 3 more.
Yeah. Okay, you're much more in tune to the data on this than I am. 100%. Do you think if Michael Jordan went to another basketball team during those 3 years, because I believe he went and played baseball, right? Do you think if he went to another team that was not the Bulls, do you think it would have been the same result? Do you think he would have
Mm.
brought them to three championships during that time?
So I love basketball. And
Okay.
any people listening right now that are basketball heads, there are a lot of opinions on what would happen here. But I want to break it down to this. I'm a big believer of like team chemistry.
Hmm.
And if you don't work well with the people in your group, like you have to have good, strong team dynamics. And Michael Jordan was an incredible leader. When you like watch the documentaries, everybody will tell you like maybe he was a bit of a hard ass,
Yeah.
but he pushed people to be better. Everybody around him. So I believe he can impact people around him, but at the same time, I don't know what the team chemistry would have been like in a different place. Like, would he have been able to have the same impact, even though he's a great leader? He had already established himself. And so when he came back for that second three-peat, everybody knew like his leadership style. Like, yeah, there was some new people on the team, but like people knew MJ and he was able to immediately reestablish himself as like a leader and build around that.
So what's really interesting about that concept is the focus on the leadership and the fact that he pushed other people around him,
Mm-hmm.
which means that yes, he was a great player, but he also created the environment in which people
Mm.
thrived and got better in.
Yeah, I can see that.
As human beings, like if you want to grow and excel, you don't stay in the same environment your entire life. My wife, when we first met, she used to say something to me all the time. She was like, "If you're the smartest person in the circle, you need to leave that circle."
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I don't really believe I was ever really the smartest person in the circle. But if you're top up there, what are you actually learning? Because you should always be going to different environments that are going to challenge you. And I honestly think that's where the growth comes from. There's something to be said about individual drive and like somebody either wanting to go from where they're at to hit whatever their end state is,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of like negative beginning or positive contributions, such as a team, right? But if we look at growth, especially in organizations, I think the environment is actually what is the catalyst for it. It's just an individual's drive which makes the difference.
Mm. Yeah. No, I the thing is like as you explained it more to me, and just using that example as a reference, like I definitely see the environment side. Like people respond differently. People can respond differently to the same exact situation. Like something happens, it could be the same thing happens to like three different people. All three of them respond differently. Why is that? Like, because every person has a different background of different experiences and values and beliefs and traumas that they've been through and all these different things. And so when something happens, their mind doesn't respond the same way. And so you put those same three people in a different environment. How do they respond to the environment?
I think that's really interesting because it's twofold, right? So we have how did they respond to the environment and how did the environment respond to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like going back to Michael Jordan, right? The environment 100% responded to him as a leader,
Mm-hmm.
to your point, right?
Yeah.
If they didn't, they wouldn't have been as successful as they were at the time. I so I think your answer of both is correct. 100%. I think it's both. I think that we could definitely just dive deeper
Yeah.
into because I personally believe that the environment plays a larger role
Yeah.
than a single person or two in like the group or your outstanding because it's the environment that pushes people forward. Like
Yeah.
it's if you're in an organization, so back to David Goggins, right? He wanted to be the baddest dude of the baddest dudes, and he phrases that differently in the book, right? Um, and so what did he do? He went and tried out for and went into buds or basic underwater survival. I forget what the D stands for. He went and tried out for the SEALs multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
He went to environments where they create what we perceive as the toughest people.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Good point.
And then later on in his book, he talks about like how his mentality at the time in some of those organizations wasn't the same as those around him. So he had to change his environment.
Also a good point. I like that.
I think drive there as a person is massive, but I think environments play such a crucial factor
Yeah.
in pushing people either forward or out of organizations.
Mm-hmm. And just think about if you're going to those most challenging environments, what people are in them. They're also the people that are going to face the challenging environment. So environment alone
Ooh,
changes the type of people that are going to be there. Like most people aren't going to choose to be in that challenging environment.
I think that's really interesting. Right. So like if you're going into an organization where like you're here, you're like, I've made this point, I want to go further. What if it's a retirement stop for most people?
True.
You know what I mean? Like, is that really like people go there as a stepping stone and move forward? But the majority of people go there to retire. So that environment, you could get stuck there. That's that's really, really interesting.
Health, fitness, fat loss, sleep, all goals that are impacted by the fuel you put into your body. I've tried meal prepping at home and I've tried multiple meal prep companies, including those that deliver, but I'll be honest, nothing has been better than the meals I get from Prepping with Peppers. They offer fresh, never frozen meals on a weekly rotating basis, so you don't have to get tired of eating the same meals over and over again. So save yourself some time for the things that matter most by ordering your meals at preppingwithpeppers.com. Yeah. Now you mentioned the changing your environment, and it triggered a story that I read. There is a guy named Damon West.
Okay.
He was a college quarterback. He had like his whole life up through college, like kind of easy button. Like he was a really good athlete and played sports, but in college he got involved with drugs. And he ultimately, like, post college, he was working, but just kept finding himself around drugs. And then it ended up getting to the point where he got into some other worse things. Ultimately, he ended up getting caught. He goes to jail. While he's in the holding cell before he goes to prison, because he went to prison. There's a older guy who's been to prison before, and he goes to him and he asks him for advice. He's like, how do I survive in prison? Like, what do I need to do to survive? Can you give me any advice, any tips? And so he tells him the story of egg, a carrot, and a coffee bean. And so he did a short book called The Coffee Bean that kind of gets into that story. But he also wrote a more in-depth book of his entire story called The Change Agent. He's out of prison now, and he's using his story to impact young lives, to help steer them away from drugs, and everything. So incredible story. But so ultimately, the guy said, what happens? You take these three different things. You've got the egg, the carrot, and the coffee bean. You take these three things, you put them in the same environment. That's what we're talking about. So you put them in a boiling pot of water. Now, what happens to the three different things that you put into the same environment? If you look at the egg is already hard on the outside. It's got its shell, but inside it's all liquid. But you put it in the boiling water and let it sit, it gets hard on the inside. And it's like, you can go to prison and you can let it make you hard inside, but when you come out, you're going to be hardened and you're no longer going to be the person that you were going in. The carrot is already pretty hard in nature, inside and out, but you put it into the pot and it softens it. It becomes soft. So once again, you can go to prison and you can be the carrot, and you are not going to be the same person. People are not going to recognize you when you come out. Or you can be the coffee bean. The coffee bean didn't change in the water. It changed the water and turned it into coffee. So super cool story. It's not mine. All the credit goes to Damon West. But I love that story. His book, The Change Agent, was outstanding. A really inspiring story of, he made some terrible decisions and he turned his life around and is using that story to try to impact and change people.
I actually really love that analogy. I think it's really good, especially like when you consider like the Michael Jordan, what we'll call this the Michael Jordan effect for this podcast, is where like he was the coffee bean because he influenced like the rest of the team, right? He drove them,
Yeah.
but it was also both ways. That actually immediately reminded me. I used to work with a guy who used to bounce at a bar in Springfield. We used to call him Cousin Vinny. He's nobody's cousin, but he's just this big tattooed biker guy. Very nice person. You wouldn't know it looking at him, but he was super nice. One day he told me a small story. He was like, I was talking to this kid one day, and he was like, "I'm under so much pressure, Cousin Vinny," and he was telling him about it. Told him what was going on in his life, and Cousin Vinny looked at the kid. He goes, um, "You put coal, right, and you apply pressure to coal. What's that make? Makes a diamond.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's time and pressure, and how you come out on the other side is kind of up to you. Yeah, it's a lot of tough things and challenges, but like you become something beautiful and valued, highly valued after you get through that event." Immediately
Yeah.
thought about that when you're talking about that.
I mean, that's a great point because a lot of the people who have gone on to the most success did it by going through a lot of pressure, like a lot of challenges, like a lot of difficult situations, a lot of failures. But people see the success, they don't see the pressure that it took to create that value. So that's a really good point.
What is it, like Elon Musk, like SpaceX, right? His first couple of rockets like failed horrifically. Yeah, and then like finally the other one went off, and then like he wasn't he wasn't like bankrupt anymore after that happened, but he had put everything he possibly could into that venture.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's a great example of somebody who has taken multiple risks. Like
Oh yeah,
he's made millions, lost it, and made it again. You know.
that guy knows
Um,
pressure like no one else.
yeah. So another topic that I, I enjoyed from the conversation a lot. Also, a lot tied back to the military, but it's not only the military. Like so, post traumatic stress. And I'll differentiate the two because I was talking about that with someone recently. Post traumatic stress and post traumatic stress disorder. Post traumatic stress being like the stress after a traumatic event that lasts for like 30 days or less, but post traumatic stress disorder being having ongoing effects beyond that 30-day mark after a traumatic event. And so that is something that a lot of people think about with the military community. There is a lot of like PTS and PTSD that happens. And I would also say people go through traumas in life, and so there's PTS and PTSD from life trauma. So it relates on both sides. And since we've established already that people grow from adverse situations, can you talk about, you brought up the concept to me when we were talking, I hadn't heard it before, of post-traumatic growth. And can you elaborate on why it may be effective for people to try to shift a focus toward growing from trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So like what we reference as so ASD or acute stress disorder is like when you're dealing with the symptoms of trauma within 30 days. PTS is just a variation of that. So think of like a car accident. Almost everybody experiences a car accident at some point in their life, right? Um, and the next time, traditionally, especially the first time after you get into a vehicle, after your first car crash, like you immediately think of the car crash. Like you slowly start to get your memories back over the course of the next couple of days, right? The next day or two, I think the 24 to 48 hour mark is really when you start to like remember
Mm-hmm.
more and more of it. That's a traumatic event, right? Just as like a normal human being, a car crash because you traditionally don't see it coming, just happens, you didn't expect it, and then bam, it massively impacts your life. It makes you consider your safety at all points and times. Um, so almost everyone has experienced a car crash, but people in general experience PTS. We we focus a lot of it. or the world focuses a lot of it on the military because I think the actual number is we're 70 times we have like a 70 times more anticipated rate of experiencing PTS in our lives than people not in the profession of the military. Um, but post-traumatic growth, to your question, it's where you take an event and you such like a traumatic event, and you learn from it and you grow from it, so that one, you're not just dealing with the symptoms of PTS for the rest of your life, but
Hmm.
you've also learned how to get through that adversity and come out stronger on the other end, right? So, an example, I think actually a really famous example now that I'm thinking about this is a gentleman by the name of Chris Kyle, like
Hmm.
specifically to PTSD, right? He had experienced, Chris Kyle was an infamous sniper on the invasion into Iraq in like early 2006, 2007 timeframe. And he was a prime example of somebody who had experienced PTS due to a lot of combat exposure, a lot of traumatic events. How he learned to deal with his PTS helped him get through it. The growth that he showed allowed him to take other veterans and other people who had experienced that trauma and helped
Hmm.
them get through the same process. So that is the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic growth. It's really just the end state and then what you do with it. Unfortunately, Mr. Kyle died several years ago, but
Yeah.
he was able to help a lot of the veteran community,
Yeah.
military community as
Absolutely.
well.
And I would think a lot of people are familiar with his story. Hopefully, like I know they made an incredible movie outlining it, but also, I mean, there was a lot of people who already knew who he was through the impact that he made with his life, which was incredible. Uh, and so that in itself is a really excellent example of that post traumatic growth. There was a woman that I had on the podcast, actually beginning of this year, Denise Metzger, and she had lost her teenage daughter
Oh yeah.
to cancer, and I mean that she's an incredible person. Hearing her story is so impactful, and she has found a way to reframe what the majority of people would see as like the hardest life event that you could imagine. And she has reframed that in a way that she has found gratitude that she had the opportunity to be her mother for the time that she had, and she's taken that story and used it to inspire people to find gratitude in their lives. And so for me, that's another just ultimate example of post-traumatic growth. That's a traumatic event for anyone, and it's led to her like dedicating her life to helping people find gratitude.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that story when I was sitting in the chair. I basically had nothing that I could possibly say to that when I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh God," um, because that's a terrifying situation to be in, and the fact that she turned that situation into something that helps others is absolutely incredible. There is a book, and we had talked about it that night. It's called "Psychology: The Mindset of Success." It's by a lady by the name of, I believe she's a doctor, Carol Dweck,
Hmm.
and she had done a lot of research in terms of challenge and adversity. Right? They basically, what they did was they took children and they followed them through their lives. But in the initial study, what they did was they took them and they would see which children would take puzzles and complete them and then move on to the next ones, or which children would do puzzles or tasks, complete them, and stay on the ones that they completed. And so what they saw as those children moved, continued to grow, they went back and visited them, and it was a like a marketed percentage, like more than 50% of the kids who had taken on higher challenges were what we would consider to be relatively much more successful than the
Hmm.
children who just kept doing the same ones over and over again because it made them feel good.
Hmm. Another great example. I'll make
Challenge
sure
and
that
adversity.
yeah, I will make sure I drop that book in the show notes too.
It's so good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just anything with research like that is incredible to learn from. So I want to circle back real quick to resiliency once again. So we talked about the importance of actually like finding the humanality in it. Like, how does it create value for me? Why would these skills matter to me? You've been in the military for over 19 years now. You have a daughter, a wife. You face some significant challenges of your own. So can you talk about that importance of like seeking help and practicing resiliency skills from your personal perspective of life?
Yeah. So there's actually a story I have about my best friend. He's currently working in a different country right now. Weird how that happens. He's a first sergeant in my old battalion, and connection. And this is where the story is going to go. One day I walked into his office. We had deployed twice together. We were in the same team in Afghanistan. We were in the same platoon, excuse me, company in Sinai years later. Um, and he pulled me in his office one day and he was like, "Hey, Joey, I'm having a really hard time." He was talking about his girlfriend. He was like, "I just need to talk to you about it for a couple of minutes." And I was like, "Sure, absolutely." This had never happened before.
Hmm.
It was just out of the blue. Like we used to call each other, talk to each other about military stuff, the infantry life. Let's grab a drink, hang out, talk about the boys, do whatever. But out of nowhere, he was just like, because I used to visit him because I lived near the unit.
Hmm.
He worked full time. He was like, "I really need to talk to you about this, get your perception." And that thing right there, and I always considered him a good friend, dynamically changed our relationship for the better.
Hmm.
He was real. He was what we would use a very scary word called vulnerable, right?
Hmm.
Been like I'm having a hard time with this relationship. I'm worried that I'm gonna lose it. And we literally just sat there and talked for like 40 minutes about it. He got a different perception, which is what you need sometimes.
Hmm.
He talked to his partner at the time about it and they moved forward. That opened the door for me to talk to him about some stuff going on in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. To this day, his name's Mikey. To this day, I we will call each other and talk to each other about what's going on. He's actually going to be my best man at my wedding. Um, he he was getting promoted to first sergeant, and he was like, "Hey," he came in, he called me. I was still in OCS. He called me. He's like, "Hey, you're the first person the packet's going through, brother. I just wanted to tell you about it." And like that is what that relationship did. It wasn't like it's not that we share all of the terrible things in our life and all of the things that we're worried about. We also share all of the positive things because we're very much connected at this point.
Hmm.
But when there is stuff that like it is worrying you or it is bothering you and stuff that you're insecure about, we talk to each other about that. And that's one of
Yeah.
the scariest things that I think I realized as a human being when me and Mike had really started talking about some of my insecurities in life that I thought only I was facing. Mikey, who's like this phenomenal infantryman, um, had the same thoughts, same issues.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, maybe this is maybe I'm not so different. Maybe I'm not the only one facing these challenges. The challenge didn't go away, but the fact that in that moment I realized I wasn't alone in dealing with it made dealing with it so much easier and less
Yeah.
stressful. Like not feeling alone in something that you feel like you're ashamed or embarrassed about.
Yeah.
understanding that other people have the same thoughts or go through the same things. Because like the month of September, this will come out October 1st, like you said, but the month of September, we really focus on it, right? On like suicide awareness. But a lot of that is people feeling alone sometimes. And the reality is like you're not. We're just too afraid of somebody judging us if we talk about what we are inherently ashamed of.
Yeah.
That connection was one of the biggest things with resiliency. And it's crazy to me because I was the emotional dude for the infantry. I didn't even start it.
Yeah.
It was my best friend just being like, "Hey, bro, me and my girl having problems. Let me talk to you about some stuff."
Hmm. Man, God, that in itself just really shows the importance of relationships and in communication, because it took a lot, I bet, on his side to actually like say like I need to talk about this, because we have that fear of like being judged or like whatever. But generally, people want to help. People find value. It makes them feel valuable to be able to help somebody when put in a situation. But what I really like is that him opening up allowed you to open up. Like you wouldn't have necessarily said something. So when you think about when it comes to building relationships built on trust, it's important to be authentic. Like it's important to be willing to be vulnerable with the people that you trust and care about, because they likely need that same thing. But maybe you have to take the first step sometimes.
What's scary about that, like what a lot of people are afraid of with vulnerability, is rejection.
Hmm.
Because like if I'm very real, if I'm very open about who I am and this person doesn't want to talk to me anymore, like what's it going to be like after? I have a saying, it's my favorite thing that I've ever come up with. True bravery requires vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you
Mm.
think about it, like you can't be brave without risking losing something. No one is brave if you run into a situation that you know you're not going to get hurt in. But that's in all aspects. It's not just your performance at work. It's not just like on the battlefield. It's Mikey is brave. Mikey was very brave in that moment,
Yeah.
talking to me about something that like I 100 could have been like, bro, I don't have these problems. I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's what that's at least what I'm afraid of when I talk about something that I'm insecure about. Like, I don't know what you're experiencing. You're weird. Why
Yeah.
are you dealing with that? When the reality is like most people have the same insecurities about everything.
Yeah. Man, that I mean, thank you for sharing that story. That in itself requires some vulnerability, but I think it's so impactful for people to really like listen to that and just understand, look at it in your own personal life. If you're listening to this, like think about if you have something that you like need to talk about, there's somebody that you can go to. You have to be brave. Like I love that quote. You have to be brave and just have the conversation and watch it drastically change the relationships in your life.
There's a caveat to that. You are responsible who you share the information with. Like, be brave, be real with
Yes.
somebody.
Yes,
But
yes, yes.
Brene Brown, who's a very famous researcher, talks about having the responsibility of the sharer is who you're sharing it with. So please, if you're going to be brave,
Ooh,
if you're going to be real with somebody, make sure you have thought about who that person should be.
man. I have to say, this has got to be one of the best episodes I've ever done. This conversation right here, I hope people hear it. Like, you all need to share this one because Joey is just dropping knowledge. So much good stuff. I want to give one more thing. You've already shared like favorite quote, best friend stories, so many great resiliency pieces. if you could just take one thing from your entire life and give one piece of advice to the younger version of yourself, what would it be?
Oh, my mentor told me this, and it really falls in line with like challenge and adversity. Um, he would say, and it changed my world. He said it to me when I was like 24, 25. I didn't really start applying it till later. The difference between the successful and the unsuccessful. Actually, what he had said was the difference between the poor man and the wealthy man is what they do in their off time.
Hmm. I like that.
That is, I think that is what I would share. Because like, I would love to come home and just play video games all the time, but like, if I don't prepare for tomorrow's work, if I don't go to school, I'm just gonna be playing video games in 6 months.
Yep. And what value will that create?
Yeah,
I mean, there are people who make a living off of video games.
I'm not that good, bro.
But right, we're
Just
not
not
all
that
that
good
level.
at
We're just not all that level. No, I really truly like that. Man, I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for like spending your time today, for sharing your story and so many lessons that you've learned along the journey that like will sincerely help people's lives.
Um, I just want to say thank you. I had an actually a really wonderful time. I was very nervous about doing this, um, but I love talking, man. It's a great conversation every time we have it, and I'm so appreciative of one meeting you and two being able to talk to you like this in this format. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. No, the pleasure is truly mine. That I was when we met and we're talking, and we also talked about introversion and extroversion. And Joey's like, "Hey, man, I'm an introvert," you know. But I mean, just opened up, and we had incredible conversation. And so, just knowing like he was an introvert, I was like, I don't know if I want to ask him because I don't want to like make him uncomfortable, but then at the same time, we're talking about growing from challenges, growing from adversity. And I was like, these conversations are far too important and can be far too impactful in people's lives to, you know, to leave to just two people to have. So I really just wanted to get it out there to the world. And so thank you for being willing to step outside of that comfort zone to share. And same to you. The conversation is always incredible. You're an outstanding person. I've loved the opportunity to get to connect with you more. And I will always consider you a friend, just from the time that we've had together. So thank you very much. I also thank you to everybody for tuning in, allowing us to be a part of your journey. Make sure that you share this episode, like, subscribe to the content, and comment with your thoughts and questions to join the conversation. And let's grow.